بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم إن الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا وسيئات أعمالنا من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله أما بعد. So carrying on then with Kitāb at-Tawḥīd, today we arrive at the chapter Bab min ash-shirki an-nadhru li ghayri Allah. From shirk is vowing to other deities besides Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Vowing to other deities, the false deities, instead of vowing to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Firstly, we need to understand what exactly is this nadhr, this vowing that we are talking about. What is the meaning of vowing? And what do we mean by vowing? What we mean by this is التزام مكلف فعل طاعة لم تجب عليه بأصل الشرع. A vow is when a believer makes obligatory upon himself some action of obedience that was not obligatory upon him in the Sharia by default. When you make a vow, you vow to do something, then you are making obligatory upon yourself something that the Sharia had not obligated upon you by default. For example, a person vows that he is going to fast 3 days from next week. There is no obligation, no fard, that a believer must fast 3 days from next week. But if a believer took a vow that he is going to fast 3 days next week, for example, it now becomes obligatory upon him, obligatory, that he must fast those 3 days next week. That action of worship and obedience is obligatory upon him now, because of the vow that he took upon himself to do that action. So this is vowing, a vow to make something obligatory upon yourself. You vow that you will do X, Y, and Z. If something is decreed for you, you vow that you will do this act of worship or that act of worship if this or that of your dua is answered. This is vowing. In the basic sense of vowing, we can say that there are two types or two categories of how this vowing may occur. Firstly, number one, that the vow is being done for Allah. You are vowing to Allah. The second type, that you are vowing to other than Allah. That's the broad categorization to begin with, that a person who makes a vow is either vowing to Allah or he is vowing to other than Allah. Then, the one who has vowed for the sake of Allah or to Allah, then either he has made a vow of obedience to Allah or he has made a vow of disobedience to Allah. So follow carefully. Either a person vows to Allah or to other than Allah. For the one who has vowed to Allah, then either his vow was something of obedience to Allah, like he vows he's going to fast 3 days next week, obedience, or his vow that is made to Allah is of disobedience. For example, he vows that he is going to cut off one of his family members. That's a vow of disobedience. If a person has made a vow to Allah of obedience, then that must be fulfilled, and it is an obligation to fulfill now. You make a vow to Allah, and it is a vow of obedience that you will fast a certain number of days, or you will go to Al-Masjid Al-Nabawi and pray there, some type of vow of obedience to Allah, then that type of vow must be fulfilled. If, however, you have made a vow to Allah of disobedience, then a vow of disobedience cannot be fulfilled. You cannot fulfill a vow that is haram, that is of disobedience, if you have vowed to cut off some family members, for example. That kind of vow is not fulfilled. As for the other side, the one who has vowed to other than Allah, then whether it was obedience, disobedience, it doesn't matter. A vow to other than Allah is, of course, not correct and haram to begin with, and that is not fulfilled. And we will come to those details further in this chapter. But that is a brief overview. A vow to Allah, a vow to other than Allah. A vow to Allah of obedience must be fulfilled. A vow to Allah of disobedience, you're not allowed to fulfill that. And we will come to the rulings in more detail later in the chapter. So the vowing, as we mentioned, it is when a believer mandates upon himself, makes obligatory upon himself that which the Sharia has not made obligatory upon him. Like he vows he's going to fast a certain number of days, or he vows he's going to go to Al-Masjid Al-Nabawi or Al-Masjid Al-Haram. He vows that he's going to do some act of worship, and by doing that vow, he's now made it obligatory upon himself. And that's why, Islamically speaking, it is makruh at least to make vows. Some scholars even say haram. Makruh at least, and some scholars even say haram for a person to make these kinds of vows. Vows of obedience we're talking about to Allah, that you vow you're going to fast 3 days next week. Making this type of vow is makruh. And some scholars even say haram. Because firstly, the Sharia has not obligated these affairs upon you. So why are you obligating upon yourself something that the Sharia has not obligated upon you? Burdening yourself with a matter that the Sharia did not burden you with. And maybe you end up failing to fulfill that vow, and you end up not being able to do what you vowed to do, and so you put yourself into trouble. So why obligate upon yourself that which the Sharia has not obligated upon you? And also, there is a hadith where the Prophet ﷺ said, إِنَّمَا يُسْتَخْرَجُ بِهِ مِنَ الْبَخِيلِ. That vowing It is only to extract some obedience out of the miserly one. The miserly one, he would not fast otherwise. He doesn't want to do the obedience otherwise. He wouldn't do it normally. So he vows to compel himself to do it. Then this is not the way of a believer. A believer should be running to do the worship of Allah, not be in this miserly state that he's only going to do it if he vows and makes it obligatory, and then he knows it's obligatory upon himself. That is extracting something from a bakhil person, from a miserly person who is not running to the worship of Allah anyway as he should be. And instead, these vows have to pull that worship out of him and drag that worship out of him. So that's why it is not something that is recommended. It is makruh that a person makes these vows upon himself, that I'm going to do this worship and I'll do that worship and I'll pray the night prayer and I'll fast and I'll do this and I'll do that, vowing all of these things upon himself to Allah. Then it is makruh to do these vows upon yourself. Rather, hasten to the worship of Allah anyway, without making obligatory upon yourself that which the Sharia did not make obligatory upon you. So here then, the first evidence that we see in this chapter is the ayah, Yufuna bin nadhri. They fulfill their vows. This is a praise Allah is giving to the ones who fulfill their vows. So what does that mean? If it is makruh or even haram, as some say, to make these vows, then how can it be praiseworthy for you to fulfill these vows? That is because the praiseworthiness is not about making the vows. The praiseworthiness is about fulfilling them if you've ended up making them. So making the vow is not something praiseworthy for you to do. That you vow you're going to fast 3 days next week. The Sharia has not made that obligatory upon you. You've made it obligatory upon yourself. That's not praiseworthy. But if you've ended up doing it, you have ended up making that vow that you will fast 3 days next week. Now it's obligatory upon you. And now if you fulfill that, then you have fulfilled an act of worship, and that's praiseworthy. It is praiseworthy, of course, to do the act of worship and to fulfill that vow of obedience. To actually make it is not recommended. But if you ended up making it, then now in this circumstance, to fulfill it and to do that act of obedience and worship, that's praiseworthy. Because you can imagine the opposite ruling. If somebody vowed to Allah that they are going to fast 3 days next week, for example, then they didn't do it, would that be praiseworthy? Of course not. Of course that would not be praiseworthy. So if somebody has ended up making a vow, then to fulfill that vow of obedience, then that's praiseworthy. And that's what Allah mentions in this ayah, in the section of the ayah, وَيُوفُونَ بِالنَّذْرِ, that they fulfill their vows, meaning the vows that have been made to Allah upon obedience. Vows of obedience made to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, they fulfill those vows. So understand this very carefully. The act of making these vows and making obligatory upon yourself worship that is not otherwise obligatory upon you, that's not recommended at all. But if you end up doing it and now you are in a situation where you are obligated by your vow to do certain worship, then it is, of course, praiseworthy that you do that worship and fulfill that vow. This indicates that vowing and fulfilling those vows, if you've ended up in that situation, is an act of worship. Once you've ended up in that situation, you've made a vow to Allah to do worship, then fulfilling that vow is an act of worship. Allah is praising the ones who fulfill their vows then, indicating it's an act of worship. And that's the point of this chapter, because many people out there make these types of vows to others besides Allah. They go to the dead in the graves and they say, I vow to you, O Wali of Allah, such and such and such and such, that if you allow us and bless us with a child, then I will come and sacrifice 3 sheep in your honor. I vow to do that for you. They make vows to the dead like this. They go to the graves and they used to go to their idols, vowing to them, I vow that I will do this and I will do that if you bless me with this or that. Bless me with this or that, and I vow I will do this for you and that for you and sacrifice for you and all types of things. And they make these vows at the graves and at the shrines, in the graveyards, at the tombs, at the idols and the trees and the stones. They vow in this way for these other deities besides Allah. And this is the point of the chapter, to highlight that vowing, even though we said it's not recommended, but if a person did it, it is done for the sake of Allah, to Allah, that you vow you will do some act of worship. As for what the people have done, vowing to the dead, believing that they have power, I vow to you I will do this and I will do that. If you bless us with a child or you bless us with success in our business or other affairs, then that is from shirk, that a person makes these vows to others besides Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. As Shaykh al-Fawzan mentions examples of what people do. They will go to the graves and say to the dead, I vow to you that I will do this and I will do that if you cure me of some illness perhaps, or I vow that I will do this or that for you if you cure my family, or if you bring us wealth, or if you do some other affair that they desire or they require. And the Shaykh highlights an important point. If some of these people go to the dead and they go to the graves and the shrines and they make vows to these deceased people, and those things that they asked for come true, that is not an evidence that the vows to these others besides Allah are working. That is not an evidence whatsoever that these vows being made to others besides Allah are working. Rather, that is a trial upon them. It is a trial which is getting bigger and bigger upon them, that the thing which they were asking for actually happened. Then perhaps this is a trial upon them. It misguides them even more because of the corruption in their hearts, in now thinking that their vows are coming true from these dead people, that it's working. When they vow to the dead, they get what they want. And that is not the case. Rather, this may be a further trial from Allah upon them, and it indicates the level of misguidance that they are upon. So this ayah in the opening of the chapter, where it praises the people who fulfill their vows, then that is in the circumstance where somebody has ended up making a vow to Allah of obedience, then it is praiseworthy for them to fulfill that vow. It is of obedience and it is to Allah, and they vowed now, so it is praiseworthy that they fulfill it now. You cannot go back on it then at that stage. The Shaykh, he gives some examples of the types of vows that would be considered vows of obedience. For example, somebody vows to do i'tikaf in the masjid for a certain number of days. I'tikaf otherwise is not obligatory. But if somebody vows upon themselves to go and do i'tikaf, now you have made it obligatory upon yourself. That would be a vow of obedience. If you're in that situation now, you've made that vow, then you must fulfill it. Or, for example, a person vows that they will visit Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa or Al-Masjid Al-Haram or Al-Masjid Al-Nabawi. They vow they'll go and visit those mosques. Again, you've now made obligatory upon yourself something that was not necessarily obligatory upon you before. Unless you have the wealth and the health, then you would go to perform the rites of Hajj, etc. But otherwise, Al-Aqsa, Al-Madinah, these things you've now made obligatory upon yourself, but they are of obedience. So if you have got into that situation, you would then fulfill those vows and do so. But like we said, the default is that you do not make these vows. And it is not recommended for a person to make these vows. The Prophet ﷺ said, لا تنظروا فإن النظر لا يأتي بخير إنما يستخرج به من البخيل. Do not vow. These vows do not come with good. It is only to extract something from a miserly person, somebody who wouldn't do their worship otherwise, and to extract it from them, to drag it out of them. The vow is now implemented. They now implement the vow upon themselves, because otherwise they know of their miserly nature, they are not going to hasten to goodness. And so you are obligating upon yourself that which is not necessary. And Allah mentioned in the Quran, يُرِيدُ اللَّهُ بِكُمُ الْيُسْرَ وَلَا يُرِيدُ بِكُمُ الْعُسْرَ. Allah wants ease for you and Allah does not want difficulty for you. So why burden yourself in obligating upon yourself that which Allah has not obligated upon you? Then the next ayah, وَقَوْلُهُ وَمَا أَنفَقْتُم مِّن نَّفَقَةٍ أَوْ نَذَرْتُم مِّن نَّذْرٍ فَإِنَّ اللَّهَ يَعْلَمُ. That which you spend from your wealth, the charity that you give and that which you spend from the wealth Allah has bestowed you with, or that which you vow from the vows that you make, then indeed Allah is aware of all of that. This ayah is a proof once again that vowing, it is shirk if you do it to others besides Allah. How? Because in this ayah, Allah puts together two things: giving in charity and spending from your wealth, and vowing. Spending from your wealth in the path of Allah and giving in charity, we know that is an act of worship. And Allah tells us, when you give from your wealth and you give in charity and you spend from what Allah blessed you with, then Allah is aware of that. Meaning, Allah will reward you upon that spending. Allah will reward you upon the spending that you do in His path. But then next to that, the issue of vowing is mentioned too, which means that must be similar to the action of spending in terms of the reward from Allah for the one who fulfills the vow of obedience that he's ended up making to Allah. So again, it indicates that the vowing is an act of worship. If you have made a vow to Allah for obedience, then Allah is aware of that. And you must now fulfill that. And there is reward for you to fulfill that now. In that situation you have got yourself into now, fulfill that obedience and fulfill that vow. And Allah is aware of you and your action and your vow and your obedience. And your reward is with Allah for the fulfillment of your vow. So this indicates that it's an act of worship. Just as spending from your wealth in the path of Allah is an act of worship and Allah is aware of it, then fulfilling a vow that you may have made, then that is also an act of worship. And therefore, making vows for others besides Allah, fulfilling those vows for others besides Allah, then that is an act of shirk. Similarly, in the final narration of the chapter, عن عائشة رضي الله عنها أن رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم قال, that the Messenger of Allah صلى الله عليه وسلم said, من نذر أن يطيع الله فليطيعه ومن نذر أن يعصي الله فلا يعصيه. That the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, whomsoever vows to obey Allah, then let him obey Allah. Meaning fulfill that vow of obedience that you've made now. But whomsoever vows to disobey Allah, then let him not disobey Allah. This indicates what we mentioned at the beginning. A vow is either done to Allah or to other than Allah. If it is done to Allah, you vow to Allah, then either you vow something of obedience or you vow something of disobedience. If you vow something of obedience, then the hadith says, مَنْ نَظَرَ أَنْ يُطِيعَ اللَّهَ فَلْيُطِعْهُ. Whomsoever vows to obey Allah, then fulfill that obedience. وَمَنْ نَظَرَ أَنْ يَعْصِ اللَّهَ فَلَا يَعْصِهِ. But whomsoever vows to Allah to disobey, to do some action that is impermissible, he vows he's going to drink alcohol. He vows he's going to cut off the relations with his family. He vows actions that are haram and disobedience. Then the hadith says, فَلَا يَعْصِ اللَّهِ. Then he is not to disobey Allah. Meaning it is impermissible for you to fulfill a vow of haram, a vow of disobedience to Allah. So, man nadara an yuti' Allah, whomsoever vows to obey Allah, like makes a vow about prayer or a vow about fasting certain days, a vow about going to Hajj, a vow about going to Umrah, a vow about giving certain charity or doing i'tikaf, other types, whatever type of obedience it may be, whomsoever vows an obedience to Allah, then now he is in a situation where it's binding upon him and he must fulfill that vow. What if he fails to fulfill that vow though? A person makes a vow that he is going to fast 3 days next week. Next week is not Ramadan. It is not obligatory to fast next week. But he vows he's going to do it to Allah. Next week comes and for whatever reason, something happens, this, that, the other. Many different reasons could be the cause, but he is prevented from being able to fast those 3 days next week. Next week comes and goes and he hasn't done it. Next week comes and goes and he hasn't done it. So now what is upon him? The scholars have mentioned upon him is the kafaratu yameen, that he must either feed 10 poor people or clothe them or free a slave. That expiation is now upon him. What about if somebody vowed to Allah a vow of disobedience? You've made the vow, but it's a vow of disobedience. Somebody vows that they're going to drink alcohol. Of course, haram. Somebody vows they are going to slaughter or sacrifice something for a deceased individual in his honor or name. Somebody vows that they are going to leave the prayer. Somebody vows they are going to cut off their family. Whatever it may be from the vows of complete haram and disobedience. If somebody makes a vow to Allah that he's going to do one of those things, obviously we know the narration says, فَلَا يَعْصِ اللَّهِ, he is not allowed to fulfill that vow. But is an expiation upon him or not? And likewise, for the one who vowed to other than Allah, is an expiation upon him? Because of course, if you vow to other than Allah, that cannot be fulfilled either. So in those circumstances, you cannot fulfill your vow. So does that mean the expiation is upon you in those circumstances too or not? There is actually a difference of opinion amongst the scholars. Some of the scholars have said, if you make a vow of disobedience or you vow to other than Allah, then those vows are invalid from the beginning. And so there is no expiation upon you. Some scholars have this opinion, that if you make a vow to other than Allah, your vow is invalid. You cannot make a vow to other than Allah. It is shirk. Your vow is invalid. And if you vow to Allah but something haram, then your vow is invalid. You cannot vow haram to Allah. So if your vow is invalid from the beginning, then there's no expiation. That is what some scholars say. And one of their evidences is this hadith, مَنْ نَذَرَ أَنْ يَعْصِ اللَّهَ فَلَا يَعْصِهِ, that whomsoever vows to disobey Allah, then do not disobey Allah. And that's it. The Prophet ﷺ didn't then add on and also expiate for what you've done for making that vow. Never mentioned that in this narration. So the scholar said, we cannot add that ruling on. Whoever vows a disobedience, you just don't do it. You don't disobey Allah, and that's it. Because that's as far as the narration goes. The narration doesn't say, and on top, you will have to expiate though. It doesn't mention that. So some scholars say your vow is invalid if it is of disobedience, and therefore there is nothing upon you and no expiation other than tawbah, of course. Other than repenting and making tawbah, of course. Other scholars, though, they have the opinion that there is an expiation to be done upon you, and this is the opinion of Aisha radiallahu anha and others. And they have another narration where there is an extra line in it, where it says that the one who vows disobedience, then he cannot fulfill that. وَكَفَّارَاتُهُ كَفَّارَةُ يَمِينٍ, that whomsoever vows disobedience cannot do that, and the expiation is the expiation kafaratu yamin, feeding 10 people, clothing them, or freeing a slave. So you have those differences of opinion on that issue there. But it's agreed upon, if you make a vow of disobedience, it is impermissible for you to fulfill it. Nobody can say, but I vowed to Allah, I'm stuck. I vowed to Allah I would do some issue which is haram. You cannot say, I'm going to have to do it now because I've made the vow to Allah I was going to do it. If you've made a vow of haram or disobedience, it is invalid. You cannot fulfill that vow. Upon you to make tawbah, and upon the opinion of some of the scholars to give expiation for that wrong that you've done. That is some of the fiqh of making vows, but the key point of the chapter was to highlight the impermissibility of making vows to others besides Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because this action of fulfilling a vow is an act of worship. If you have made a vow to Allah of obedience, then to fulfill that is an act of worship. So vowing comes under the acts of worship of ibadah, and therefore it is impermissible for a person to do what many people do. They go to the graves of the great imams and they say, I vow to you, I will fast 2 months in a row or 6 months in a row, if only you would bless us with a child. And I vow to you that I will pray night prayer for a whole month every night if you bless us with something in our business or whatever it might be. They go and make these kinds of vows to the deceased, to the shrines, to the graves, as the mushrikun used to make vows to their idols and deities, and this is haram and impermissible, and it is shirk to make these vows to others besides Allah. And as for the believer making the vow to Allah, then that is permissible, but as we've said, it is not recommended that you do so to make obligatory upon yourself that which the Sharia did not make obligatory upon you. But if you did do it, then it is praiseworthy that you fulfill that vow of obedience to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and fulfill what you have vowed that you would do. So that is the end of that particular chapter from Kitāb at-Tawḥīd. So we'll conclude upon that one today, and we'll begin with the new chapter from next time, insha'Allah ta'ala. وصلى الله على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم.